It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. Joining me on the show today is Ethan Waldman, who is a tiny house author, speaker, and teacher. And Ethan built his own tiny house on wheels in 2012 and has been passionately helping future tiny house dwellers on their journeys ever since. Ethan's guide, Tiny House Decisions, has helped thousands of readers answer the big questions about tiny houses and plan each system in their future home. He's also the creator and host of the Tiny House Lifestyle podcast, a show that brings you conversations with tiny house luminaries, builders, and DIYers. Ethan was actually on the show back in episode 25 talking all about tiny house decisions, and I've asked him to come back on the show today to share more with us about how he no longer lives full-time in his tiny and is instead renting it out on Airbnb. And in this conversation, we talk about how Ethan's situation changed from living long-term in his tiny to turning it into an Airbnb, the arrangement that Ethan has with the landowner where his tiny house is parked, the composting toilet situation and how that's worked out so far. We also talked about lessons learned and what Ethan would do differently if he were to have built his tiny home for the purposes of short-term rentals now that he's had people staying in it for a while. Ethan also shared some stories of a few mishaps that have taken place during the time of the tiny being an Airbnb and lots more. It's great to have Ethan back on the show to get an update on his life and what's been happening for him recently as well. So, on to this tiny house conversation with Ethan. Ethan, welcome back to Tiny House Conversations, and thanks so much for being here again.
Thanks so much for having me back, Lucy. It's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was thinking about doing season 2 of the podcast that I started just recently again, your name was definitely one of the first ones that came up to the list. And today, because your situation of living in a tiny house full-time has sort of changed and you've turned your tiny house into an Airbnb, I wanted to sort of explore that with you today. But first, before we do that, can you just share with us a bit about what you've been up to lately? Because I do understand that it involves a renovation of some sorts of a new home.
Yeah, my wife and I bought a 100-year-old home, and I embarked on a big renovation project. It had been probably 10 years since I did any meaningful building, so it was really great to get my hands back on some tools. And as always, or as I remember, I felt very humbled by just the process of renovating a house, which is much different and I think actually harder than building one from scratch. Everything has to happen in the wrong order. If you want to add electrical, it's not like the walls are open. You're kind of fishing things through. And so I embarked on a big renovation project.
I love that because I'm assuming that a lot of these things the skills that you developed and the experience you had of building your own tiny house many years ago would have definitely come in handy. But then I find it so interesting that you talk about how, it would be a very different experience where you're building from the ground up and, starting all the systems from scratch versus sort of trying to do things that are already in place, and depending on how those systems are already set up and how the layers of the home are already constructed, there'd probably be a lot more things that you're learning and navigating and having to sort of work with along the way. So I find that really interesting, actually. And is the renovation still in progress? Like, as you're living in there now, are you doing like little bits and pieces along the way too, or are you mostly complete?
Mostly complete. There's a couple of little projects still out there. I actually, right before I jumped on the call, I was putting a third coat on the stair treads. The stairs had carpeting on them, but they're beautiful, like probably 100-year-old pine stair treads. And so I stripped them down and sanded them, and I've been refinishing them. But Anne, my wife, is getting pretty tired of walking on 2x4 stair treads, so I'm trying to get those done. And I also built the kitchen island. So I'll get to dust off my cabinetry, carpentry hat, which I haven't done any of since the tiny house build.
Yeah, oh, I love it. And I'm just curious, any sort of lessons or key lessons or takeaways along the way of that renovation that you've had going through this process this time around, as opposed to when you were building many years ago of your tiny.
I mean, I think as always, building is really hard, especially if you don't do it professionally. And so I think the value of stopping is really important because, what seems insurmountable at 2 o'clock in the afternoon after, a meal and a good night's sleep first thing in the morning, sometimes you're like, oh, it's obvious. This is how to do it. So take breaks.
That's a really good, I think a good life lesson in general, right? Is like, because otherwise, if we're always going, 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 and we're busy and we're moving from one thing to the next, doesn't matter what it is, whether it's renovating, building a tiny, but everything else, we do need
Yeah,
that space and that rest too, so that we can come back stronger. So I love that you said that. And thank you for the update on that. It's really great to hear
yeah,
about. And so I would love to just switch gears here a bit and sort of go into this um, just discussion about your Airbnb, the way that you set up your
sure.
tiny home now. And, speaking to many different people on and off the podcast over the years about tiny house living. And, sometimes people's situations can change. Some people might live in a tiny home long term, sorry, full
Yeah,
time for a long period of time, and others might do it for a small chapter of their lives, or it might be a sort of transitional phase before maybe they move on elsewhere. So I'm just curious for you, what was it that changed or came up in your life that sort of made you go, okay, I think tiny house living, it was here for a while, it served a purpose, and then now it's actually time to move in a different direction, and then that decision to make it an Airbnb.
yeah. So when I built the tiny house, it's more than 10 years ago now, started in 2012, I was dating Anne, who I eventually married, but we weren't living together yet, and I was still very much kind of in my 20s, and it was a house that I was really building for me so that I would have an affordable place to live. And so I finished the house, and as time went by, Anne and I decided to live together, and she actually already owned a small condo. And so like my need for a tiny house of my own, kind of went away. And for years and years, we kept the tiny house on some land that we rented, and we would go there. She's a nurse, so she works like 2 weeks on, and then would have large chunks of time off. So we would go live in the tiny house when she wasn't working. And it was kind of like a retreat, a place where we could go to relax and to just, live the tiny lifestyle. Over the years, I would say that we like the culmination of that was we actually hosted our wedding at the tiny house on the land where the tiny house was. So we had like
Oh,
175 people. We had to rent a huge tent and a dance floor. I actually built two small sheds to use as humanure outhouses because we
oh
didn't want to
wow.
use like porta potties, those chemical toilets. For some reason it was so much work that almost after that I almost felt like, okay, I need like a break from being at the tiny house. I've like put in so much work here, I just want to relax. Then the pandemic hit, fast forwarding a couple years, and the land that the tiny house was on actually changed hands. So there was a new owner of the land who had told the first owners that we would be able to stay there. But then, soon after he closed on the land, he kind of was like, oh, I can't, my insurance company says, like, you can't do this. So we had to move the house, and it was during the pandemic. Everything was just so uncertain. And so I ended up moving the house back to the spot behind the barn where I built it at my parents' house. And it wasn't hooked up to utilities. It wasn't hooked up to anything. It was just kind of in storage. And there it sat for the first year and a half, 2 years of the pandemic, and I felt bad about it. I felt weird that the house was sitting there not being used. What actually happened first was a friend of my mom's needed a place to stay and, just straight up offered, hey, can I rent that tiny house? I don't care. I don't care that it's not hooked up to water. We had run an extension cord out to it at that point. And so we had somebody live there for 6 months. And this was the first time that I had ever rented it out. I kind of didn't think that I ever would want to rent it out, but we started renting it out. And I realized that, hey, I don't need to keep this for myself. And what a great source of income. What a great way to kind of complement our income. And so I began just looking around for a new place to park it because I knew that my parents didn't want to have an Airbnb behind their barn. And so I found somebody who was willing to host it and was excited to have Airbnb guests staying in it on their property. And I had the house moved. I think it's May of 2022 is when it moved. And since then it's been a full-time Airbnb.
Oh, nice. So it's still in Vermont, yeah, like the area that
Yes.
you live. Yeah,
Yep.
okay. And have you found like has it been booked out quite a lot? Have you found it being quite popular a lot of the year, or are things changing over this? I think the last couple of years has also sort of seen housing crises of people being homeless or, that type of thing. So I'm just curious about what you're seeing in terms of having an Airbnb rental even.
Yeah, I mean it's always stayed pretty booked. It obviously goes up and goes down based on, the season here. We have in Vermont, there's in addition to spring, summer, winter, and fall, there is mud season and stick season.
Yeah.
Mud season is like it's about now. It's like the end of March, April, sometimes into May, when all the snow melts and there's a lot of dirt roads in Vermont. So it's very muddy. The ground is very wet. And then stick season is, after all the leaves fall off the trees in the fall, but before there's any snow and everything is just kind of bare. And that's like
Right.
late October, November. And so those two times of year are like the low season for tourism here. And so those are
Yeah.
the two times of year that are the least booked up. But, people on Airbnb especially are often looking for a unique experience. And so a tiny house, I get plenty of guests who I can tell are like interested in tiny living and are kind of checking it out, renting a tiny house to see the system, see what it feels like. And then other people are just like, yeah, I needed to come pick my kid up from college and it looks cool to stay in a tiny house, So it's just like half and half, I would say. Some people are seeking out a tiny house and other people are like, well, if I'm choosing between like someone's guest room and this sweet little tiny house, I'm going to choose the sweet little tiny house.
I'm assuming over where you are in the States and then, here in Australia, there's so many more people, especially in the last year. It's just grown
Mhm.
exponentially, and there's lots of different demographics of people looking at tiny house living full time for themselves. And I think when there
Yeah.
are options of, say, short term stays like an Airbnb that you have, it's actually really helpful to give people a taste into, well, can I actually see myself doing this longer term? Like, can I actually downsize all my stuff? Or, how much space do I actually need? And, all these different things that go into it's like trying before you're buying, I suppose, because maybe some
Yeah.
people might find that actually maybe I couldn't do this for long term, and then other people will be like, yeah, I can definitely do this. So I think it's
Yeah.
really cool to know of the different groups of people that you're seeing come through. Yeah. And are you plugged into like what's the setup like with the utilities and everything and the grey water and I know you've got a composting toilet too and power and water in this new parking space?
Yeah. So the host actually had a tiny house parked there. Somebody else rented the spot and, did the
Ah.
work of running there. So it's parked behind kind of a big garage or a barn. And so there was already power in the barn. I had to do
Right.
some wiring work to, add the right size and shape of plug. Water was already run out there from the basement of the house, in a trench all the way out to where it's parked. So somebody put in significant time and expense to do that. So yeah, it's hooked up to water, it's hooked up to power, and it's just kind of tucked in. In terms of the systems in the house, I haven't really changed much in terms of how it was when I stayed there. It's still a humidor style Joe Jenkins compost toilet.
Mhm.
The biggest change there is that I use a compostable liner bag in the bucket, which makes it a lot easier to change the bucket, just easier to keep clean. And I compost right on site. I built 2 compost bins. And yeah, everything is pretty much the same.
Has the composting system been received? Because I know for the people that stay there, because I know for some people,
Yeah.
they've used them many times, and other people's it's a completely new experience and can take a bit of getting used to. So what's the overall response been from, yeah, using it?
Very positive. I mean, or most people don't really say anything at all about it, but I've never gotten a complaint about the compost toilet. I have a pretty
That's good to hear.
comprehensive kind of a user manual for the tiny house. When people come in, it's like they can scan their a QR code with their phone and pull up the manual. And I mean,
Yeah.
essentially the instructions for the compost toilet are like, if it smells, add more sawdust.
Yeah.
And if it still smells, add more sawdust. Like, I mean, that's pretty much all you have to do.
And
Yeah.
I'm just curious. So you said you've got the landowner, that owns the
Yeah.
land where what Tiny is parked. Because I
Yeah.
know people ask about this, and you don't have to give specific details, especially if it's a bit private.
Sure.
But just is the arrangement that you have that you sort of look after and maintain the Airbnb and changing sheets and greeting guests and that type of thing, and then
Yes.
it's just like a percentage split with the person on the land. Is it that type of arrangement? And do you have other people helping you with the cleaning and stuff, or are you doing it all yourself?
I thought about doing a split like that, but I actually just pay the landowner a flat rent.
Yeah.
And that includes the parking spot,
Yeah.
the electricity, the water, and actually internet too from their house. In terms of running the Airbnb, managing it, helping guests, all of that stuff is my responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. So it's essentially is if you were living in a tiny home, it's like you'd be paying some kind of rent and maybe some
Exactly.
bills and things like that. So it's sort of like that. Okay, that's interesting because I've heard like there's many different ways to do it, and different people are doing different
Definitely.
things. But no,
Yeah,
yeah, that sounds
I've
like a
heard
good
of
setup.
people doing the split like that, and I think
Yeah.
that that can work, especially if the landowner is interested in being the host and like doing the flip, cleaning the house between guests, dealing with the laundry. Then you can really look at doing a revenue share.
Yeah.
They kind of have some skin in the game. But for this, I think it's a win-win for both of us because the landlord essentially is earning rent from a kind of unused corner of their property. And, I'm getting a place to park my tiny house where I can, manage the Airbnb.
Definitely sounds like a mutually beneficial arrangement. And
Mhm.
so I'm just curious because I know that over here in Australia, especially, there's different things that people are doing with tiny homes. So there's definitely like a bigger demand or interest in long-term living, but there's
Yep.
also, I think, as I mentioned at the start, people's situations are changing all the time. I think, as you
Yeah.
also talked about with your own story,
Hmm.
whether it's getting in a relationship or whether it's having children and expanding a family. And so that tiny
Hmm.
house that they were living in full time, they've outgrown it for their life situation. And so then there's some people that are selling their tiny home, but then there's also other people looking at, well, what are some other options I can take if I want to
Yeah.
actually hold on to my tiny home? And whether it's renting out like what you're doing with Airbnb, but we're
Hmm.
also actually seeing over here a demand for long term. rentals of so people are
Yeah,
not coming to someone's parking space with their own tiny home, but they're actually wanting to rent a tiny home that's already there long term. Maybe they can't afford to buy one,
definitely.
and all of that. And I'm just curious because you did mention before. That you were renting out for about 6 months. I think it was like to a family friend or something like that, or a
Yeah,
family
yeah.
member. Was there any sort of consideration for you in terms of when you were deciding Airbnb or like continuing with like a long-term rental situation? Because obviously it's a different setup where if there's a long-term person living in there, they're very self-sufficient. You don't need to come in and clean. You don't need to
Right, right.
manage, guests coming and going and all of that. What was the sort of decision for you in terms of going which way or what worked best for your situation?
Yeah, well, with the person who was there initially, it went well, although like the reason that they left is just that their living situation changed and they moved out of the area. I was not super thrilled with certain things about how they kept the house. And, it wasn't built really as a rental. So like there's a
Yeah.
lot of natural wood, a lot of things that like if they get really wet, it's not good. So I think that I like with an Airbnb that like nobody's staying there for more than I've had guests stay up to a week, but not really much more than that. So, and some people take care of it like amazingly well. Other people leave it, not so great. But I feel like I can keep an eye on it and kind of be in there addressing issues, kind of dealing with maintenance things more often as an Airbnb. I'll be honest, I'm able to make a lot more money doing it as an
Yeah.
Airbnb than I am as a long-term rental. Yeah, I mean, since it's become kind of an integral part of my income and how I earn a living, and recognize that there is a shortage of housing and that I probably could find somebody to rent it long term. And so it's I feel bad, but that's how I'm doing it for now.
Yeah. And I think that's okay, like everyone's
Yeah.
in different situations and has different intentions and
Airbnbs get a really, a bad rap in a lot of places. And I
yeah.
think I feel okay about it because I don't really know that I would want to rent it out long term. So I don't feel like I don't feel like I'm taking a house off of the market, essentially.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit worse when somebody, just buys a house that could have been a rental or could have been somebody's house and turns it into an Airbnb. I can understand the anger that people feel about that because it is taking housing kind of out of the stock. I think that if I couldn't do Airbnb with my house, I might think about, okay, well, how can I move this somewhere where I'm going to use it more,
Yeah.
because I miss staying there too.
Yeah. Yeah. And you built it from the ground up yourself. I definitely hear you in the Airbnb these days, I think does seem to get a bit of a bad rap because of all the
Yeah.
housing stuff going on. But I think also I see it from the point of especially with your podcast and all the different things that you've
Mhm.
been doing in the tiny house space for years now, your
Mhm.
courses and your other free content, and like you are helping people in a very big way. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being paid for something, especially when you're helping other people. And,
Mhm.
the reality is these days with capitalism and all of the things is like we're all
Yeah,
just trying to do our best and get by and make a living. And when you're
sure.
doing it in a way where it can offer someone an insight into tiny living, which then you don't know what could happen to a guest after they've stayed at your that might have actually really changed the game for them. And they've said, oh, maybe I can live in a tiny home and maybe this path is for me. And then they've gone and, done that. I think there's lots of hidden benefits that can come from having an offering like that because you could
Yeah.
be in
Yeah.
business in a different way that's unethical and it's not helping people. But this is obviously a big part of people's lives when they have a home and housing and all of that. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think of it in a different way. But I can see both sides at the same time. So, but I think there's no right or wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah, especially I think when it comes back to the intention. So yeah, and I'm also just curious about. So you said it was around May 2022 that you started the Airbnb. So now that it's
Yep.
been almost a couple of years, I'm also very
Yeah.
curious about now that you've had experience and maybe there's different things that you've noticed about the tiny house, how it's set up for this Airbnb situation. Is
Yeah.
there anything that you would do differently if you were to add on things to your tiny house build or have things set up in a different way for the purposes of short-term stays like this?
Well, yeah, I think that as I mentioned before, like having things that are easily damaged, like wood,
Yeah.
if I was going to be building a tiny house specifically as a rental, I would try to use, as durable of materials as I could, maybe choose different finishes, like some of my stains and things on the windowsills and window casings are like, it's not super heavy duty. The compost toilet is both a benefit because it allows you to park the tiny house, in a lot more locations. But I think from a cleaning perspective, and you asked me before whether I do all the cleaning myself or whether I have people helping me. And it's really a mixture of things because it is, I generally am renting it out for like 1, 2, and 3 nights at a time. There can be several cleanings a week. So it's nice to have someone to help. I do all the laundry actually, and
All right.
obviously do all the communication with the guests. So, in terms of finding a cleaner and making it easy to clean, a flush toilet would be a lot easier. I think that's the one
Right.
kind of ick factor for a cleaner to say, like, oh, and you also need to empty this bucket full of pee and poop into the compost
Yeah.
pile, clean it, and then put a new bag in it and put it back. And I do think the ladder access loft, it is not that easy to make a bed up there. So just like thinking about different ways to make the space easier to clean. So, if it's a bigger tiny house and you can do a first floor bedroom rather than a loft bedroom, that would make, changing sheets a lot easier. And the toilet is also one that having a non-compost toilet, just a standard flush toilet would make things easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess you don't know these things until you actually just have that experience. Now
Yeah.
you've had some people come through and stay, and then you're like,
Sure.
oh, okay, yeah, these are the
But I
things,
mean,
yeah, that
if
I,
I
yeah,
I think that like if I built another tiny house, I would probably still put a compost toilet in it just because it is so hard to find a parking spot where you can actually hook up a flush toilet. So there's
yeah,
there's the practicality of that. But, on the wish list for the ideal Airbnb.
yeah, absolutely. And it's good
Yeah.
that you've got the Joe Jenkins style bucket system. People over here will often have the self-contained with the urine diverter, and it all just
Yeah.
gets a little bit. It's not as simplified, I suppose you could say.
No.
And so yeah, and especially for men, and all that kind of stuff in it. So it's just yeah, I think it's good just simplify it, and then it's sort of using it as it is if it's a regular toilet, but without flushing it and just having to put
Yeah,
some composting material in there. I think it's good. Yeah.
I
Um,
agree.
and I'm just curious as well. So now that it has been a couple of years, do you have any interesting stories to like Airbnb stories or crazy things that have happened? Or I know you said you've had, guests that some people are really tidy and others maybe not so much, but are there any like interesting things that have happened or any mishaps during the time?
Two things come to mind. Our second guests ever in the tiny house put a burning hot cast iron pan directly on the counter and like burned
Oh
this huge
no.
ring on the counter. So I was just like, oh, it was like this very second guess. They were super apologetic about it. And
Yeah.
but yeah, it was just unfortunate that it happened so quickly. And then the other one is like this is more just the reality of a tiny home and a house that's getting older and probably inexperienced too, but I had a major mouse infestation this fall. I did a whole podcast about it, but amateur builder me didn't do a great job on the soffits. And so they were just wood and the wood shrank, leaving like gaps. And so had a pretty big mouse infestation. Luckily, like the guests, like I was able to deal with it mostly while no guests were there, which was lucky. But a couple of guests did encounter mice, and they were super super nice about it. The other mishaps that I've experienced have more been about like systems. This winter was actually really mild in the US, but last winter we had some very cold, -20-degree Fahrenheit weekend, a couple days at a time, and my water supply actually froze twice
Oh,
where it
wow.
comes out of the ground. So systems in a tiny house are always like the fail point. Luckily, guests have always been really gracious about it, and of course, as a host, you always have the option to just, and I do, I'm just say like I'm really sorry, and just give somebody a refund and say I'm really sorry, but you're not going to be able to shower because the water's frozen.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah,
See, we don't I mean, I think there's parts of the country where we have the snow, but for the most part
yeah,
it's very unheard of. Yeah, like I imagine the taps freezing in a really cold winter air.
yeah,
That's so fascinating. And
yeah,
uh also, something that I heard you talk about, because I know you do have an episode on your podcast, and we can actually put a link in the show notes for the mouse episode that you just talked about, but also on your episode talking about your Airbnb. I
yeah.
understand that you said it was you've sort of gone down the path of creating an actual business, an LLC, which I think in Australia here, the transferable terminology is a proprietary limited company, PTY Ltd, I think. Don't quote me
Okay.
on that though, but I'm just curious about, so for you, the decision to go down that path of actually creating a separate business entity for this purpose of an Airbnb, separate to, everything else that you're doing.
Definitely. I like to ask people who know better than I do for advice. And I spoke to an accountant when I was kind of setting this up and asked what their advice was. And that was the advice. And essentially the idea with an LLC, a limited liability company, is that, if somebody got hurt and sued me, that it would protect personal assets from business assets. And so, the LLC is the host of the tiny house and gets paid to do that stuff, but the tiny house is owned by me. And so, in theory, it should protect the house in the
Yeah.
event of something like that. But also, I always recommend, people have insurance for their tiny homes, and if they're going to do Airbnb, make sure that your insurance is okay with that.
Yeah. And do you have insurance through Airbnb as well as additional insurance for different purposes?
You do. I mean, the Airbnb provides you with some liability and damage protection, but I've heard mixed things about it, whether, how easy it is to get them to actually pay out. And so I have like it's essentially a homeowner's insurance policy on the tiny house also.
Okay, that's good to know because I know
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
very common question just in general with tiny houses is like, what do I do for insurance? Whether it's a person that's living in a tiny home, whether it's someone that's renting it out, whether there's a landowner. So yeah, that's good to know. And I guess I would just say to anyone listening, because we do have listeners many different countries too, is just to sort
Yeah.
of look at your countries or your areas tiny house association for more information about those things proceeding further and everything. So thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah.
as we start to close out the conversation today, Ethan, I'd love to just know, is there anything else that you feel like we may have not covered just in terms of what we've been talking about with having a tiny house as an Airbnb? And then maybe we'll check in with like what you're working on at the moment, what's happening with all your offerings, podcasts, and everything like that.
Sure. Think that you did a great job. You asked a lot of great questions. I think that for anyone listening who's considering it, you know that it is a lot more work than renting out your house just long term. And so I think that it's one of the reasons I think why I do it as an Airbnb is that, like, I said before, I can make more money doing it as an Airbnb, which is true, but I also am willing to put in the work to do it, to answer people's questions and to go down there and clean it several times a week and do all the laundry and keep an eye on it. And so that's just my all the other piece of advice is just that it is a lot of work to do a short-term rental, but it's worth it.
Yeah. If you've got the time, that's what I was about to say. It's a caveat. So it's like if you're sort
Yeah,
of tossing up between those two options, I guess it depends on how much time you have to be able to put into
exactly.
maintaining it all and looking after guests and everything. Yeah. So thank you for saying
Exactly.
that. And
Yeah,
with your Tiny House Lifestyle podcast, so do you want to let people know maybe some of the most, and we can put a link, of course, in the show notes, but just some of maybe the most recent episodes what type of topics you're talking about, or what kind of guests you're having on the last few episodes.
sure. Well, the episode that I did about the mice is episode 286. That was
Okay.
a couple months ago, but that one was if you're curious about more about what happened and how I dealt with it, that's out there. I actually just had on a kind of a new compost toilet company. They're called Throne. It's kind of a new take on a urine diverting compost toilet. I think it's an interesting design and I like what they're doing. I still would probably personally go with just the bucket, but that was episode 291. There's lots of great episodes on the feed. I don't want to like start listing all these
Yeah.
episodes, but I also did one about the Airbnb that you mentioned, and I think that is episode 222.
Okay, perfect. I
Yeah.
can definitely put all of those in the show notes and then also just encourage everyone listening to go and check out the Tiny House Lifestyle podcast. I know that we actually share many listeners as well,
Yeah.
but given that we're both on, opposite sides of the world, it's nice to hear more about what's happening across the pond over in your area. And I know that you had me on a little while ago when you did your tiny house summit. Actually, do you have any other plans to do more of those in the future, or other things, other projects that you might be working on? I know you've taken a break for a lot of things while you've been doing this renovation, but is there anything on the horizon or different things that you're thinking about doing within the tiny house space?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I would say that everything that I'm thinking about is in its infancy. So nothing
Yeah.
that I can really share as I'm still working on some renovation work here. I'm mainly just focused on putting out a new episode of the podcast every week and,
Yeah.
and trying to send the best newsletter I can on Tuesdays.
Yeah, sounds good. I still get
Yeah.
your newsletter, so it was nice to hear from you because I know you did take a break for a
Okay.
little while.
Yeah. Yeah.
If anyone wants to check out your website, or even I know maybe you're not as active on social media. I think you said this
Mhm.
last time, but where would be the best place that people can come and check you out if they want to see what you're doing, listen to the podcast, or come and say hello or anything like that?
Sure. Yeah. The website is thetinyhouse.net, and you'll find my show, the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, there. And then also, just in all the places that podcasts are presented, Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.
Awesome. Again, everything will be in the show notes at tinyhouseconversations.com. So, Ethan, thank you so much for joining me on the show again. Really appreciate your time and just, sharing your experiences and wisdom about tiny houses. And just thank you for what you do for the greater tiny house community. It's really, really appreciated. And as you know, and I said this to you last time, your show's been a really big inspiration for me. And it's just, yeah, really nice to connect with someone on the opposite side of the world that's in a similar space. So thank you so much again for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And if you're listening to us at home, thank you so much for being here as always. Make sure you go check out what Ethan is doing over at the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast. Again, all those links that we talked about today will be at tinyhouseconversations.com. Stay tuned every Thursday for new episodes of the podcast. See you next week. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.